At the Thanksgiving dinner, my son's voice sliced through the laughter like a cold blade. "Just stop talking, Mom. Nobody cares." I froze. The fork slipped from my hand, clinking against the china. The room fell silent for a second. Then just as quickly the chatter resumed. Everyone pretended it hadn't happened. But I heard it. Every word. That night, I quietly packed my purse, withdrew my money, and decided I was done being the silent giver in everyone else's story. Before continuing, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching this story from, because what I'm about to tell you is still unbelievable. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 62 years old, a retired nurse, a widow, and a mother who once believed that love meant sacrifice. My small apartment smells faintly of lavender, the only scent that still makes me feel at peace. The clock ticks softly in the background, and the hum of the refrigerator keeps me company in the silence that used to scare me. On my lap rests a faded photograph. Thomas and I on our wedding day, standing outside our first apartment, laughing like we had the world in our hands. I trace his face with my thumb, remembering how alive he looked that morning. It's been 30 years since his heart stopped beating. 30 years since I learned how cruel silence can feel. I remember the night after the funeral. The mirror reflected a woman I didn't recognize. Red eyes, trembling hands, a widow with a 10-year-old boy depending on her. I pressed my palms to the sink and whispered, "You'll never know the struggles I faced. I'll make sure of it." That vow became the fire that kept me alive. From then on, I worked until my body ached. At Christview Hospital, I pulled double shifts until sunrise, sometimes skipping meals just to save money. I cut coupons, mended old uniforms, and drove my rattling car to every shift like it was a chariot, carrying my promise. Every dollar I saved went into a small account labeled Ethan's Future Fund. It wasn't just money. It was my purpose, my hope, my way of keeping my husband's memory alive. When co-workers laughed about weekend trips or fancy dinners, I smiled and said I was too tired. The truth was simpler. I couldn't afford to live for myself. I was too busy living for him. Still, there were moments of light. When Ethan brought home a report card filled with A's, I pinned it above the kitchen sink and cried quietly. His victories were my reward. His laughter was my paycheck. The night he told me he wanted to go to college out of state, I smiled and said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart." But when he went to bed, I sat at the table with my calculator and stared at numbers that refused to make sense. The truth? I had no idea how I'd afford it. But mothers don't give up. They find a way. So I worked harder, slept less, ate less, smiled more, because I believed love would come back someday, in the same way I gave it. But love doesn't always return. Sometimes it fades quietly while you're too busy holding everything together. Now, sitting in my quiet apartment years later, I wonder, how did the walls I built to protect my son become the walls that keep me out of his world? Because soon, I'd learn that even the purest sacrifices can turn into regrets. And one dinner table insult would only be the beginning of my awakening. Don't miss the next part, because that's when love turns into something colder. After Thomas passed, my life became a blur of motion. No pauses, no rest. Just survival disguised as purpose. I wasn't living. I was maintaining, like a machine that had forgotten it was once alive. At Christview Hospital, I was known as the reliable one, the nurse who never complained, who picked up extra shifts, who smiled through exhaustion. I wore that reputation like armor. Every time fatigue clawed at me, I'd whisper, "Keep going, Margaret. He's counting on you." I'd come home long after midnight. The apartment would be dark except for the nightlight glowing in Ethan's room. Sometimes I'd stand in the doorway, watching him sleep, his small chest rising and falling. That was all I needed to keep going. Just knowing he was safe, warm, and dreaming in a world I built for him. I often wondered if he'd ever understand what those years took from me. The aching feet, the cold dinners, the quiet tears at the sink. But that's what motherhood is, isn't it? Giving until it hurts, and smiling like it doesn't. One winter night, while washing my scrubs, I noticed a gray strand of hair I hadn't seen before. I laughed softly to myself. So this is what love looks like, I thought. Tired, but still standing. Over the years, Ethan grew into everything I'd hoped for. Kind, smart, ambitious. When his report cards came home covered in A's, I taped them above the kitchen sink like tiny trophies. His success made every sacrifice worth it. Then came the day that changed everything. He came home with a large envelope in his hands and tears in his eyes. "Mom," he said, voice shaking. "I got in?" It was his dream school, New York University. I pulled him into my arms, my heart swelling with pride and fear all at once. After he went to bed that night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the tuition costs. It was more than I made in a year. My fingers trembled as I pressed buttons on my old calculator, rearranging numbers that still refused to work. But mothers don't quit. We adjust. I took another loan, signed up for every available overtime shift, and sold my wedding jewelry for the first semester's payment. I told myself it wasn't a loss. It was love in another form. 4 years passed in a blur of sleepless nights, aching hands, and hospital corridors. But the day I saw Ethan in his graduation gown, I felt whole again. When they called his name, I clapped until my palms burned. He didn't see me in the crowd, but I didn't mind. My promise was fulfilled. That night, I returned to my quiet apartment and looked around. Every piece of furniture, every faded photograph, every unpaid bill, all of it told the story of one woman's devotion. I smiled softly, whispering, "We did it, Thomas. He made it. I thought the hard part was over, but life has a way of testing the strength you think you've already proven." A few months later, Ethan brought someone home. Her name was Isabella, though she insisted everyone call her Bella. She had a polished kind of beauty, the kind that turns heads when she enters a room. High heels, perfect hair, and perfume that lingered long after she left. She smiled politely and said, "It's lovely to finally meet you, Mrs. Collins." Then her eyes scanned my small living room, pausing on the old sofa and the crocheted blanket draped over the armrest. "Your place feels very homey." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes told another story, one I didn't want to see yet. Ethan looked at her the way I used to look at Thomas, like she was his whole world. I forced a smile and asked, "Would you like some tea, dear?" She nodded, sitting gracefully, crossing her legs with the ease of someone used to being admired. As I poured her a cup, she glanced at the old photograph of Thomas on the wall. "Was that your husband?" "Yes," I said softly. "He was the love of my life." She smiled again, thinly this time. How sweet. For the first time in years, I felt small in my own home. Tell me honestly, what would you do if someone new entered your life and suddenly made you feel like a guest in your own story? Would you ignore the unease? Or trust your instincts? Because I ignored mine, and soon that silence would cost me everything. Don't miss the next part, when kindness begins to look a lot like control. The first few months after Ethan's graduation felt like a dream come true. He landed a promising job in the city, moved into a bright new apartment, and called me every few days just to check in. Every time the phone rang, my heart leapt. It felt like all the years of sacrifice were finally worth it. Then, slowly, the calls became less frequent. And when they did come, they were shorter. At first, I told myself it was normal. Young people get busy. He had a new job, new friends, and a new love. But deep down, a quiet ache began to take root. Ethan's girlfriend, Isabella, was polite. But there was always something cold in her politeness, like warmth that had been practiced, not felt. When they got engaged, I smiled and congratulated them with all the grace I could muster. But when I looked at Ethan, his eyes were somewhere else, focused on her, not me. I told myself that was how it was supposed to be. Children grow up. They build their own worlds, But no one tells you how it feels when you realize yours doesn't include you anymore. Their wedding was beautiful. An expensive event in a riverside country club. I remember Isabella describing every detail to me over dinner one night. White roses, crystal chandeliers, and a 10-piece live band. Her voice sparkled with excitement, but every word felt like a reminder of what I couldn't give. Ethan came by one evening, avoiding my eyes. "Mom," he said softly. "We're a little short on the wedding budget. Could you help us out?" Of course I said yes. I always said yes. I broke into my retirement fund and wrote the check with shaking hands, telling myself it was love. Watching him smile when he saw the amount made my heart swell and ache all at once. The night of the wedding, Isabella was radiant, glowing under the chandeliers like she'd been born for that kind of spotlight. Ethan looked at her with so much pride that I couldn't help but smile. But as I stood at the edge of the dance floor, clutching my glass of champagne, I realized something. No one even noticed I was there. The music swelled, the crowd laughed, and for the first time, I felt invisible. After they married, they bought a house, a big one in Hyde Park, with marble counters, a garden, and more space than two people could ever need. Ethan called it an investment, but when the bank hesitated, I co-signed the mortgage and gave them the down payment from the last of Thomas's life insurance. "You've always believed in me," Ethan said, squeezing my hand. I smiled, but inside, something in me cracked. When I first visited their new home, I noticed how spotless everything was. White curtains, polished floors, the scent of luxury candles filling the air. Isabella's smile was picture perfect, but her eyes flickered past me like I was a background detail she couldn't quite erase. I started coming over on Sundays. It became a ritual. Me bringing my homemade pies, helping set the table, telling stories about Thomas. The grandchildren, Leo and Chloe, loved those stories. Their laughter made everything feel worth it again. But slowly, that laughter started to fade. When I spoke, Isabella would check her phone or glance at Ethan with that subtle, knowing look. Sometimes she'd interrupt me mid-sentence, her voice light and sugar-coated. "Oh, Joan. Sorry, I mean Margaret. Those old stories are adorable." I'd laugh it off, pretending I didn't notice. But I did, and Ethan did too. He just stayed silent. Every time I left that house, I felt smaller, like I'd been shrinking one Sunday at a time. One evening, as I stood washing dishes after dinner, I overheard Isabella whisper to Ethan in the next room. "She means well, but she's too involved. Maybe she needs a hobby?" I froze. My hands trembled under the warm water. Too involved. That's what she called a lifetime of love? That night, driving home in silence, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and saw it clearly for the first time. This wasn't my family anymore. It was theirs. If you were in my place, watching your own son slip away while someone else rewrote your place in his heart, would you speak up? Or would you wait for the moment they finally pushed you out completely? Because that moment was closer than I realized, and when it came, it would break everything I had left. Don't miss the next part, when one dinner changes everything. Sunday dinners had become a routine I clung to like a lifeline. Every week I'd bake a pie, polish my shoes, and drive to Hyde Park with a basket of food and a heart full of hope. I told myself that if I just kept showing up, Ethan and Isabella would remember who I was, what I'd given. Their house always looked like something from a magazine. Candles glowing, music playing softly, laughter drifting through every room. But behind all that beauty, there was a chill that never seemed to leave. Isabella would greet me with a perfect smile. "Margaret, you didn't have to bring dessert again," she'd say, taking the pie without meeting my eyes. Then she'd disappear into the kitchen, leaving me standing by the door like a visitor instead of a mother. Ethan tried to bridge the gap at first. Small talk about work, asking if I was keeping busy. But even those conversations felt rehearsed, as if he was afraid of saying the wrong thing in front of her. I pretended not to notice. One Sunday, I brought something different. A worn leather photo album I had kept for years. The pages smelled faintly of dust and time. Inside were pictures of Ethan's childhood. His first bike, his first day of school, Thomas teaching him how to fish at the lake. They were pieces of a life I wanted his children to know. After dinner, I placed the album on the coffee table. I thought maybe Leo and Chloe could see where their dad came from, I said, smiling. Isabella barely looked up from her glass of wine. Oh, Margaret, not now. The kids are tired. Her tone was light but final. Ethan hesitated for a moment before saying, Maybe later, Mom. So I sat there quietly, flipping through the album alone while everyone chatted about vacations and new furniture. Each page felt heavier than the last. The next few visits grew quieter. The children started glancing at their mother before they laughed at my stories, as if waiting for permission. Once when I mentioned how Ethan used to chase butterflies in the yard, little Chloe giggled and said, Daddy already told us that one. I smiled, but something inside me broke. At home, the silence pressed harder. I would sit with a cup of tea, staring at the same four walls, replaying the little moments. The polite smiles, the interrupted stories, the way Ethan's eyes never quite met mine anymore. One evening, I decided to call him. Maybe I just needed to hear his voice. He answered after the third ring. Hey, Mom, can I call you later? We're having dinner. Of course, I said softly. Love you. The line went dead before I finished the sentence. That night, I finally allowed myself to say it aloud. They don't need me anymore. I told myself I was being dramatic, but deep down, I knew the truth. The woman who once built their world was slowly being erased from it. Still, I showed up the next Sunday. Habit, maybe? Hope, definitely. The house gleamed as always. Roast turkey, rosemary, candles flickering in gold light. Isabella looked stunning in burgundy silk, moving through the room like she owned every inch of it. Dinner began with laughter, stories, and polite toasts. I tried to join in, but every time I spoke, the conversation shifted elsewhere. I could feel the distance like a glass wall between us. Then, as I started to tell a story about the first Thanksgiving Thomas and I shared, Ethan sighed, softly but sharp enough to cut. Mom, he said, forcing a smile. We've heard that one before. The table went still. Isabella smirked behind her wineglass. I swallowed my words, my chest tightening. What would you do if someone you loved looked at you like a burden instead of family? Would you keep pretending everything's fine? Or would you finally stand up for yourself? That night I said nothing, but something inside me began to harden, slow and quiet, like glass cooling into steel. Because the next Thanksgiving, the words he spoke to me would shatter the rest of the life I'd built, and I would never be the same woman again. Don't miss the next part, when silence finally breaks, and a mother's love turns into resolve. That Thanksgiving, I woke up before dawn, determined to make it special. I baked 2 pies, roasted vegetables, and packed everything carefully in the same basket I'd carried for years. I told myself it didn't matter if they used caterers or preferred store-bought desserts. Family was about tradition, not perfection. The morning air was cold and crisp as I drove through the quiet streets toward their house. My heart beat faster with every turn, a mix of excitement and unease twisting in my chest. I rehearsed kind words in my head, hoping that maybe this time, things would feel like they used to. When I arrived, the house looked breathtaking. Polished floors, gold-rimmed plates, candles flickering softly across the long dining table. Everything gleamed with warmth and beauty. Yet somehow, I still felt out of place. Isabella greeted me in a deep red dress that shimmered under the lights. Oh, Margaret, you didn't have to bring anything, she said sweetly, glancing at the pies. The caterers have it all covered. I smiled, ignoring the sting. It's just tradition, I said softly. Thomas and I always made pies together. If it makes you happy, she replied, her tone as polished as her jewelry. The meal began with laughter, clinking glasses, and soft background music. I watched my grandchildren whispering jokes to each other, their smiles lighting up the room. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe everything was okay. But that illusion didn't last. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily between everyone else. Vacations, promotions, home renovations. I joined in where I could, careful not to talk too much, afraid of saying something that might annoy Isabella. I just wanted peace. Then, during a lull in the conversation, I smiled and began, "You know, your grandfather and I spent our very first Thanksgiving eating roasted chicken because we couldn't afford turkey that year." I laughed gently, remembering the moment, how Thomas burned it completely, and we ended up eating mashed potatoes from a box. "We laughed the whole night," I said softly, my eyes distant with nostalgia. "Mom," Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp, flat, and cold. "Shut up, nobody cares." The words sliced through the room like a knife. For a second, no one moved. The sound of silverware clinking stopped. My heart pounded in my chest as the air turned heavy. I looked at him, expecting to see remorse in his eyes. But there was none. Isabella hid her smirk behind her wineglass. The children stared at their plates, their faces red with confusion. I tried to swallow, to breathe, but my throat had turned to stone. He didn't even look at me again. He just kept cutting his turkey. A small laugh escaped Isabella's lips. "Oh, Ethan," she said playfully, as if it were a harmless joke. Everyone else went back to eating, pretending nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I folded my napkin slowly, my hands trembling. "Excuse me," I whispered. "I think I need some air." No one stopped me. I walked down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a slap. I stood on the porch, staring through the window at the people I once called my world. They were laughing again, as if I'd never existed. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. All the years of sacrifice, the double shifts, the sleepless nights, the money I'd given, none of it had bought love. It had only taught them how to take. I realized something that night. When you give everything to people who never learned gratitude, they start to believe they're entitled to your soul. Tell me honestly, if someone you loved humiliated you in front of everyone, would you forgive them, or finally walk away? I stood there for a long time, my breath fogging in the cold air, watching the golden light flicker through the windows. I didn't cry, not yet. But as I gripped the edge of my coat and stepped off that porch, something inside me hardened into resolve, because that night, a mother's love ended, and a woman's strength was born. Don't miss the next part. That's when she begins to take back everything they took for granted. The drive home that night felt endless. Streetlights stretched into blurs, my reflection flickering in the windshield. Tired eyes, trembling lips. A woman stripped of her place at the table she had built. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't crying. I was done crying. I was thinking. When I reached my apartment, I didn't even take off my coat. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall clock ticking above the stove. For 30 years, I'd lived by time. Work shifts, school schedules, loan payments, deadlines. But in that moment, I realized time had stolen something I could never earn back. My worth in their eyes. I made tea, though I didn't drink it. The steam curled upward, fading before it reached the ceiling. Just like me, I thought. Fading, disappearing, unseen. That was when a strange calm came over me. The kind of calm that happens right before a storm begins. I stood, walked to the closet, and pulled down a metal box I hadn't opened in years. Its hinges squeaked in protest. Inside were folders, documents, and receipts. Decades of careful saving and responsible choices. The mortgage deed, the insurance policy, the joint bank account papers. I spread them out across the table, the paper edges catching the light. Every page told a story of sacrifice. Every signature was proof that I had carried more than my share. I traced my name on the mortgage form. Margaret Collins, printed neatly beside Ethan Collins. My contribution had built their dream home, yet somehow, I was the outsider. I felt anger rise inside me, sharp and unfamiliar. Not wild fury, but something colder. Clarity. He thinks I'm powerless. I whispered into the quiet. He thinks I'll always say yes. The refrigerator hummed softly, almost as if the room itself was listening. I gathered the papers into a tidy stack, aligning each corner perfectly. Years ago, those papers meant responsibility. Tonight they meant leverage. I went to bed just before dawn, but I didn't sleep. My mind replayed the scene at the dinner table. The laughter, the dismissal, the feeling of being erased. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. When morning came, I opened the curtains wide. Sunlight spilled across the document still lying on the table. It felt symbolic, like truth shining where shame had once lived. I made a list, clear, methodical, like preparing a patient chart at the hospital. First, the joint emergency fund. Second, the mortgage. Third, the car registered under my name. And finally, my will. I called my lawyer's office that afternoon. I need to make some changes, I said calmly. The woman on the phone hesitated. Are you sure, Mrs. Collins? These are significant revisions. I'm sure, I said. My voice didn't shake. It's time to redirect my life where it actually matters. Then I called the bank. I'd like to transfer the joint funds into a new account under my name only. When the clerk asked for a reason, I smiled faintly. Because I earned it. Each phone call lightened me. Each confirmation email felt like another chain snapping loose. For decades, I had defined myself by giving. That day, I discovered the quiet power of taking back. Still, a small voice in my heart whispered, You're a mother. Aren't you supposed to forgive? Forgive? Yes, forget? Never again. Tell me, if the people you sacrificed everything for turned their back on you, would you still protect them? Or finally protect yourself? By evening, my apartment looked exactly the same, but everything inside me had changed. I wasn't the woman who left that Thanksgiving dinner in silence. I was someone new, someone with nothing left to lose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I packed a small suitcase. Only the essentials. Clothes, my nursing license, the wedding photo of Thomas, and the metal box of documents. I paused at the door, taking one last look around. The quiet no longer felt lonely. It felt like freedom, because the next sunrise wouldn't find me here anymore. It would find me somewhere they'd never think to look. Somewhere I'd finally start living for myself. Don't miss the next part. That's when she finally disappears, and her silence becomes her strength. I left before the city woke. The sky was still bruised with dawn when I closed my apartment door for the last time. No note, no explanation, just quiet resolve. The suitcase felt light in my hand, but the weight on my heart was gone. The streets were empty as I drove through the sleeping neighborhoods, past the hospital where I'd spent half my life. I didn't glance at it. I didn't need to. That chapter had already ended. I headed south, letting the highway unfold beneath me like a ribbon of possibility. Ohio faded into Kentucky, then Tennessee. Each mile stripped away a layer of guilt I hadn't realized I carried. By the time I crossed into Georgia, the winter chill had softened, and the air smelled faintly of pine. For years, I had imagined freedom as a destination, something you arrive at after everyone finally thanks you. But it isn't. Freedom is a quiet decision you make alone, somewhere between grief and acceptance. By late afternoon, I reached the coast. A small town called St. Augustine called to me with its whitewashed buildings and the sea glittering in the distance. I found a modest apartment overlooking the ocean. Clean walls, sunlight pouring through every window. The landlord, an older woman with kind eyes, handed me the keys without asking too many questions. That night, I unpacked the essentials, set Thomas's photo on the nightstand, and stood barefoot on the balcony. The waves crashed gently below, constant and alive. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. I just breathed. The next morning I brewed coffee and carried it outside. The sea breeze tangled my hair as gulls circled overhead. My phone sat on the table silent. No calls, no messages, no apologies. And yet, for once, that silence didn't hurt. It healed. I opened my laptop and began the final step of my plan. I emailed my lawyer, Susan, a woman who had quietly handled my affairs for years. I need to update my will, I wrote. Everything I own is to be placed into a scholarship fund for nursing students in Thomas Collins's name. Make it irrevocable, she called within the hour. Margaret, that means your son receives nothing. I know, I said softly. Leave no room for dispute. There was a pause, then a sigh of understanding. I'll handle it. Next, I contacted the bank to remove myself from the Hyde Park mortgage. The representative hesitated. Mrs. Collins, that will force refinancing. I'm aware, I replied. Send the paperwork today. Finally, I called the insurance company about the Lexus Ethan and Isabella drove. It's registered under my name, I said. Report it for repossession. When the last call ended, I closed the laptop and leaned back, listening to the hum of the ocean. My pulse was steady, my breathing even. Each decision had been deliberate, measured not by revenge but by balance. For decades, I'd kept them safe from consequences. It was time for them to meet reality without me holding the net beneath them. I poured myself another cup of coffee and smiled faintly at the thought of their confusion when the letters arrived. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. They'd finally see how much of their world existed because of me, and how quickly it could vanish when I stopped carrying it. Sometimes love isn't about forgiving the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's about teaching them what your absence really means. If you were in my place, after all the disrespect, the silence, the heartbreak, would you go back and try to fix it? Or would you walk forward and never look over your shoulder again? As the sun dipped low over the horizon, I felt the tide shift within me. The woman they dismissed had vanished with the dawn. What remained was stronger, quieter, and unshakable. Because the next sound that would fill my phone wasn't laughter or love. It would be the echo of panic when they realized I was truly gone. Don't miss the next part. That's when silence becomes the loudest answer of all. 3 days passed before the silence broke. At first, it was one call, then another. And by the end of the week, my phone looked like a storm of missed connections. 55 in total. I didn't answer a single one. The screen would light up with Ethan's name. And for a brief moment, my heart would flicker. Then I'd let it ring. When the first voicemail arrived, his tone was composed, almost impatient. Mom, where are you? This isn't funny. Call me back. I could picture him sitting at that marble kitchen island, tapping his fingers against the counter, assuming I'd cave like always. I smiled faintly and deleted the message. By the next day, Isabella's voice trembled through the speaker. Margaret, please. The tow company just took the car. They said it's registered in your name. I don't understand what's happening. Please call us. Her panic spilled into the air like a note off key. I recognized that sound well. It was the sound of consequences catching up. By the 5th message, Ethan's composure cracked. Mom, the bank called. They said you've withdrawn from the mortgage and we have 30 days to refinance. What are you doing? You can't just do this. This is our children's home. His words shook, breaking between anger and disbelief. Our children's home. The irony made me laugh quietly. I'd been the one to give them that home, to co-sign the loan, to fund the down payment. And in one short sentence, he'd reminded me exactly why I'd walked away. Families don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly, like sand underwater. You think the structure's still strong until the tide pulls back and you realize it's already gone. I sat on the balcony, the Florida sun warm on my face, listening to each message like a weather report. It wasn't revenge, it was release. My silence was my answer. When I finally checked my mail, I found a single envelope from my lawyer confirming everything. The nursing scholarship fund was established in Thomas Collins's name. All legal assets had been transferred. My will was finalized. For the first time in years, every part of my life felt in my control. The next morning, I walked to the local clinic where I'd started volunteering. The building was small, tucked between palm trees and pastel houses. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt peace. The scent of antiseptic and coffee blended into something oddly comforting. "Morning, Margaret," one of the nurses called. "You're early again." "I guess old habits die hard," I said, smiling. Helping there filled a space inside me I didn't know was still empty. These patients didn't see me as a burden. They saw me as a healer. Every gentle word, every smile, every hand I held reminded me who I was before exhaustion and sacrifice buried me. After my shift, I walked along the beach, waves lapping at my feet. The water was cold, cleansing. The sky stretched endlessly above me, pink and gold. I breathed in deeply, feeling lighter than I had in decades. Back at the apartment, I brewed coffee and checked my phone again. Another message. Ethan's voice, softer this time. "Mom, please. We're scared. Just tell us you're okay. Please. We'll fix everything." I paused for a moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I pressed delete. There was nothing left to fix. Because sometimes silence isn't cruelty. It's clarity. The world doesn't end when you stop giving. It begins. Tell me honestly, if you were finally free after years of being taken for granted, would you answer the phone or keep walking toward peace? That night, I stood on the balcony again, watching the sea reflect the moonlight. The waves roared softly, steady and eternal, like they were applauding the quiet courage it takes to start over. And as the phone buzzed one last time behind me, I didn't turn around. Don't miss the next part. That's when peace becomes power, and endings find their purpose. The days that followed were quiet, peaceful in a way I had never known. The sound of the ocean replaced the noise of old worries. I woke up with sunlight on my face, instead of the weight of obligation pressing on my chest. Every morning, I'd take a walk along the shoreline with a cup of coffee, greeting the same fisherman, the same stray cat that followed me halfway down the beach. There was a rhythm to this new life, one that didn't demand or take. It simply flowed. Sometimes I'd find myself thinking about Ethan and the children, not with bitterness, but with a distant kind of sadness, like remembering a house you used to live in. I wondered if they still gathered for Sunday dinners, if the silence at the table ever reminded them of me. At the clinic, the nurses started calling me Mama Collins. Patients smiled when I walked in. Their gratitude filled the spaces that guilt once occupied. When I left each evening, I didn't feel drained. I felt useful again, whole again. One afternoon, as I sat on the bench outside the clinic, Susan, my lawyer, called. "Everything's settled," she said. "The scholarship is active. You should be proud, Margaret. You're helping people who remind me a lot of you." I smiled. "That's the point, Susan. I spent my life giving to people who never noticed. Maybe now it's time my giving actually meant something." When I hung up, I felt tears forming, not from pain but from gratitude. That evening, the sky burned orange as I watched the sun dip beneath the waves. My phone sat beside me face down. I hadn't turned it on in days. For a moment I thought about everything that had led me here. The long nights, the tears I hid, the words I never said. I realized that silence, the very thing that once felt like punishment, had become my strength. The more I thought about it, the more I understood something I'd never allowed myself to admit. I had been trying to earn love from people who only knew how to take it. Love shouldn't have to be earned. It should be safe, gentle, reciprocal. I picked up my journal and wrote 3 words on a blank page. I'm finally free. The next day, as I returned from the beach, a small envelope was waiting outside my door. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter. Ethan's handwriting. Shaky. Uneven. Mom, I don't know if you'll ever read this. We're sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't realize what I was doing until you were gone. Everything feels different without you. The house doesn't feel like home anymore. Isabella keeps saying we'll figure it out, but it's not the same. The kids ask about you. Please, just tell us you're okay. I love you. Ethan. I read it twice, my heart aching with a mix of pain and peace. There were no tears this time, just understanding. People rarely appreciate your presence until it becomes your absence. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my journal. I didn't need to reply. He already knew the answer he was looking for. It was written in everything I'd stopped doing. Tell me, if you finally found peace after years of pain, would you reopen old wounds just to prove your love? Or let silence speak for you? That night I lit a single candle by Thomas's photograph and whispered, I kept my promise. To him and to myself. The wind carried the scent of the sea through the open window, brushing against my face like a quiet blessing. Because sometimes, walking away isn't the end of love. It's the beginning of self-respect. Don't miss the next part. That's when her story finds its true ending, and peace finally stays. Months passed, and the sea became my companion. Every morning I'd sit on the balcony with a cup of coffee, watching waves crash against the shore. They came and went, constant, unstoppable, free. I began to see myself in them. There was no bitterness left in me, only peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop chasing explanations and start embracing acceptance. The apartment had grown warm and familiar. Seashells lined the windowsill, sunlight painted golden shapes on the floor, and the scent of salt water lingered in the air. Life had become simple again, quiet, yet full. One afternoon, while I was organizing files for the clinic's new nursing fund, my phone buzzed. It was a picture from the scholarship team. 3 young women standing together in white uniforms, smiling proudly beneath a banner that read, The Thomas Collins Memorial Scholarship Recipients. Tears welled in my eyes. For years I had poured my love into people who saw it as duty. Now that same love was building futures for those who truly understood sacrifice. I whispered softly, We did it, Thomas. We really did it. Later that evening I took a walk along the beach. The air was cool, the horizon blushing with twilight. I passed families laughing, couples holding hands and children chasing the tide. Every sound, every face reminded me of life. Messy, unpredictable, but beautiful, all the same. As the sky darkened, I found a smooth stone and traced my thumb over it. I thought about Ethan and the grandchildren. I didn't hate them. I didn't even resent them anymore. They were simply living the lessons I had unknowingly taught. That love gives without asking. That mothers always forgive. That silence means surrender. But not anymore. I had broken that cycle. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. Some lessons are learned too late, and that's all right. What matters is that I finally learned mine. Back home, I lit a candle by Thomas's photograph. The flame flickered gently, casting soft shadows on the wall. You'd be proud of me, I said quietly. I finally stopped waiting to be seen. For the first time in my life, I realized something profound. You don't owe anyone your pain just because they share your name. The next morning, I received one more letter from Ethan. It was shorter than the first. Mom, I don't know if you'll ever respond. We refinanced the house. We're okay. The kids are okay. But it doesn't feel right without you. I understand now. I really do. I held the paper for a long time before setting it aside. I smiled. Not with sadness, but with peace. He was learning, finally. Growth often blooms in the cracks left by regret. If you were in my place, if the people who broke your heart finally realized what you meant to them, would you go back, or would you let your peace answer for you? I chose peace. That evening I stood on the balcony one last time before sunset. The wind danced through my hair, carrying the scent of salt and hope. I closed my eyes and whispered to the waves, "Thank you for taking me away and bringing me home." The phone buzzed again behind me, but I didn't move. Some calls aren't meant to be answered. Some stories don't need a return, because sometimes the loudest message you can send is silence filled with self-worth. Take a second to like and subscribe, and press the bell icon to stay with me for more stories like this one.